It doesn't really matter if the Americans have the better decor or the better goaltending because that's how damn good Connor McDavid is.
You're listening to the PuckUps podcast. It's time to hit the ice with Brian D. Felice.
Welcome into episode 11 of the PuckUps podcast. I am Brian D. Felice, and thank you all for joining me. On today's show, we're going to recap group play from the men's Olympic ice hockey tournament in Milano Cortina and preview the playoff bracket that is set to get underway throughout the course of this week. And in doing so, ask the question, can anybody really beat Team Canada? I mean, I know hockey is the ultimate team sport, but the way Connor McDavid is playing, I just have a real difficult time envisioning him leaving Milano Cortina with anything less than a gold medal wrapped around his neck. So we'll get to that a little bit later on. But first and foremost, I wanted to get to something that I've seen online over the last handful of days, which is this narrative comparing the Four Nations face-off to the Olympics. A lot of people out there are saying how much better the Four Nations face-off was in comparison to the Olympic Games. And what I would say is that it's a little bit premature to make that comparison when Four Nations concluded a year ago, and we know how it ended and started. But the Olympics right now, they're barely out of group stage, and a lot of these comparisons came during the first day or two of group play. So not only are the two tournaments completely different animals and under far different circumstances that I'll get to in a second, but the Olympics haven't concluded yet. And the top teams have yet to play each other with massive stakes on the line. So I would just say, A, comparison is a thief of joy. Let's just let things stand alone and enjoy them for what they are. But B, if you're going to make that comparison, at least wait until the Olympic Games are over, in my opinion. But I mentioned earlier the difference in circumstances and the difference in the tournaments and why it's not really appropriate to compare the two other than they're both international hockey. I mean, first and foremost, the Four Nations tournament had such a demand, appetite, and desire because we hadn't seen NHL players don their national crest since 2016. Well, at these Olympic Games, we've only had to wait a calendar year since we last saw it. Now, granted, Four Nations only had four teams in the Canadians, the Americans, the Swedes, and the Finns, but at least we saw NHL players wear their international uniforms against each other in a small capacity last year. When Four Nations came around, it had been 8 years since the 2016 World Cup of Hockey took place in Toronto. So I think that Four Nations already had the perfect storm of buildup and anticipation that the Olympics just don't have that ability for, because while, yes, we haven't seen international best on best at the Olympics since 2014, we at least got a small appetizer with Four Nations. For Four Nations, we hadn't had an appetizer or a meal in nearly a decade in terms of NHL players playing each other with international stakes on the line. So that's the first difference. Four Nations had the circumstances in its favor. People were salivating to see NHL players wear their national team's jerseys. Okay. The second big difference is that the Four Nations face-off was played under NHL rules. It was a tournament conducted by the NHL and the NHL Players Association, whereas the Olympics and other international tournaments are conducted under IIHF rules and regulations. And under IIHF rules, you are not allowed to fight. And if you are indeed guilty of fighting, you're kicked out of the game and possibly suspended for further games after that. Well, the Four Nations face-off tournament, as I said, under NHL rules and regulations, fighting was absolutely condoned. And it made for one of the most memorable hockey games of my lifetime, which was Canada versus US Saturday night in Montreal in the Bell Center for the first time since 2014 playing each other with NHL players, that is. And you have 3 fights in the first 20 seconds of the game, including one off the opening faceoff, a second off the next opening faceoff, and then a third at the first whistle. So if your argument is that's exactly why I like the Four Nations better than the Olympics, is because it does have NHL rules and that there was fighting allowed, then I can't argue that because fighting's not allowed at the Olympics. So you're never going to get that at the Olympics or any other international tournament conducted under the jurisdiction of the IIHF. The other thing I will say in terms of the Four Nations face-off and the argument for that is the element of it being played on North American soil was great because you had the close proximity for all the NHL fans and American and Canadian fans to attend those games in their own country. Obviously, the first games being in Montreal and the latter ones being in Boston. So that created a bit of an atmosphere advantage for Four Nations as well. But the Olympics being over in Milano Cortina this year, the atmosphere has been very, very, very passionate and loud for not just the European teams, but also for the Canadian team and the Americans as well. Every single team has had a ton of support. Every game has been sold out, both in the men's and women's tournaments. So the atmosphere has actually been really good in Milano Cortina, Milano in particular for the hockey tournaments. But yeah, it's a night and day difference comparing the Olympics and the Four Nations. They really aren't appropriate to compare. They're both international hockey, but it's like comparing, apples and oranges. The other thing I'll say is Four Nations was one of one. It was a unicorn of a tournament. It never happened before, will never happen again. In fact, the NHL and the NHLPA do have future World Cups of hockey on the schedule for the next duration of their CBA. And they are anticipating having more than just Four Nations involved in those games. Hopefully, from a competition standpoint, Russia is included again in these tournaments because it really is not complete best on best without them. And that includes these current Olympic Games in Milano Cortina. But winning Four Nations was a good feather in the cap for whoever won it. Obviously, the Canadians did. And it's great for bragging rights until the Olympics. To win an Olympic gold medal is the pinnacle of being an athlete, both an individual athlete or a team sport athlete. And I would just say, are the Olympic Games going to reach the excitement level of the Americans and the Canadians dropping the gloves in front of a sold-out Bell Center on a Saturday night in Montreal? Not necessarily, especially if you're somebody who really wants to enjoy the physical element of hockey. But for US and Canada to be competing potentially for Olympic gold medal is something that we haven't yet witnessed in these games this year. And the last time we saw the two teams play for gold medal was in 2010 in Vancouver. So it's a long-winded way of me saying, just because there's no fighting allowed in the Olympics and just because the group stage didn't have the highest of stakes or the best of teams playing doesn't mean that the Olympics as a whole isn't still the bigger tournament and the most prized tournament. And we also haven't seen the best hockey that we're going to see yet. So listen, if you think that the Four Nations was more entertaining and you loved it a lot better than the Olympic Games so far, I'm not trying to convince you otherwise. I understand every reason why one would fall in love with the Four Nations face-off. I would just say there's really no reason to have to compare the two. They're just different animals altogether. So, all right, moving along now to group play. Now, for my money, the biggest surprise and shock during group play actually happened in game one of the tournament, which we discussed last episode. And that, of course, was Slovakia defeating Finland. Now, as group play has concluded, Slovakia indeed did win Group B, and they have a bye to the quarterfinals. That to me is the biggest surprise from the group stage. Everything else kind of played out the way it was anticipated to do. The Canadians dominated Group B, the Americans slightly less so dominated Group C, and Group B, which was the one that was up for grabs, in my opinion, certainly between the Swedes and the Finns, actually goes to the Slovakians. And Team Finland does get a bye to the quarterfinals as well as the 4 seed, but the Swedes have to go to the play-in round, and they may have a date with the Americans in the quarterfinals that we'll get to in just a little bit. So let's start off by recapping the action that was on Friday, which was Finland versus Sweden. Now, that was one of the biggest games heading into the tournament that I was looking most forward to watching in group play, that along with Canada versus the Czech Republic. And the Finns got the upper hand on the Swedes in this game 4-1. It was a tightly contested game for the most part. The score wouldn't necessarily indicate that, but it was a close, hard-fought game between two rivals and two teams that I had pegged as the third and fourth best teams on paper heading into this tournament. The Finns get the win here. Canada rolls over Switzerland 5-1. The big story in this game was Kevin Fiala getting injured late in regulation. He, of course, has now been ruled out for the remainder of the regular season in the NHL with the LA Kings and will be reevaluated heading into the postseason. But he had multiple fractures in his leg after having an ugly fall with Tom Wilson. It just kind of looked like not a dirty play. It was just an unfortunate situation where Fiala tried to reverse hit Wilson, and Wilson kind of fell on top of him in a weird way. And tough news for the Swiss as it pertains to the Olympics, and really tough news for the Los Angeles Kings as it pertains to the rest of their regular season and postseason hopes this year. Slovakia had a 3-2 win over the Italians following their opening tournament win over the Finns. And credit to the Italians in this tournament. They obviously had a tough loss to Finland that we'll get to in short order here, but they played hard. Italy and France, they entered this tournament as the projected 11 and 12 seeds after group stage, and that's exactly how it played out. But you have to give them credit. They worked really hard, and they did not make it easy on opponents. Again, the Italians had a very lopsided loss to the Finns in their final game of group play, but not much was expected of these rosters. Italy in particular had no NHL or AHL representation, I don't believe, certainly not any NHL representation. And the French only had Alexander Texier as a current NHL player. Stefan DaCosta had a couple of games in the NHL about a decade ago. Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, a longtime NHL veteran. He was the French captain, but he's not currently playing in the NHL. So it was just a really difficult tournament for the Italians and the French to medal in. Obviously, nobody gets eliminated during the group stage, so both of these teams are still in it right now, but they will be playing the 5 and 6 seeds in the qualification round. And then the Czech Republic with a 6-3 win over France to finish out action on Friday, February 13th. Moving along to Saturday, Sweden gets their win over Slovakia. Now, this one was interesting because Sweden won the game, but the way it finished, you would have thought that Slovakia won. And the reason is Sweden had a 5-2 lead in that game late in regulation, and Slovakia was able to score, make it 5-3. And the significance there was that solidified the group for Slovakia. because Slovakia and Finland and Sweden all finished with 6 points and the same record in group play. But the Slovaks had the best goal differential. And had they not scored that third goal, I believe the group would have gone to Sweden or maybe Finland. But the Slovaks were able to uh, secure the lesser of a loss, lesser of a defeat, and they were able to capture Group B. Latvia with a bit of an upset over Germany. We saw Latvia play the U.S. in Game 1. They're a scrappy team. The Latvian program, they show well in these international tournaments in the last couple of years. They obviously aren't regular medal finishers, but they have a scrappy program, and we saw against the U.S. that they're not going to go down without a fight. And Germany has some real firepower. Again, I talked about it in the Olympic preview episode that Germany's roster isn't very deep, but they do have some high-end talent in Leon Draisaitl, Mo Seider, Tim Stützle, and JJ Peterka. So the fact that Latvia was able to get a 4-3 win against Germany was impressive. And Bruins prospect Dan Zlashmelis had 2 goals in the winning effort for the Latvians. And then Team Finland had their 11-0 win over Italy on Saturday. Again, I mentioned that a few moments ago, that the Italians, they fought hard in group stage. They really did. This was the one game where it really just got away from them, and having a roster full of NHL stars on Team Finland against a roster of no NHL players in Italy, the score is what you expected. But it was the first time all tournament that Italy really got blown out like that. So the Finns did what they had to do, and that win helped them get the 4th seed and the bye to the quarterfinals. USA had a 6-3 win against Denmark. Now, this was the game where, if you're a Bruins fan, had you shaking your head a little bit regarding Jeremy Swayman's first period, because the Danish, I think, had maybe 2 goals on their first 4 shots, and one of them obviously was a shot from center ice that Jeremy Swayman just cannot let in. The first goal that went in on Swayman, it wasn't a great goal in the first couple minutes of the game, but it went off his defenseman's skate. But nonetheless, the U.S. was able to still weather that storm of misfortune in the first couple of minutes of the game, where they outplayed Denmark, but somehow they're losing on the scoreboard. So the U.S. was able to get a 6-3 win and improve to 2-0 in group play, which led us into Sunday, where the Swiss, without Kevin Fiala, earned a 4-3 overtime win over the Czech Republic. David Pastrnak had a assist on a tying goal for the Czechs late in regulation to force that game to overtime. I would say it's been a relatively quiet tournament so far for Pastrnak. I know he has a goal and a couple of assists, but he is one of the best players in the world, and I just feel like he was quiet against France. I mean, France had Czech Republic on the ropes when they played. They were up 3-2 on the Czechs in the second period, and you kind of saw, watching the game, David Pastrnak turn it up a notch a little bit when he realized that his team was now losing. And you just kind of wish that you had that energy from Pastrnak from the drop of the puck in the first period. Now, when his team did go down 3-2 to the French, he was able to get the tying goal in short order on a wraparound. But again, I'm looking for more from David Pastrnak in the knockout stage here. So we'll see what happens with him in Czech Republic. I know the loss of Pavel Zacha, as I've said before, it's a loss for the team in general, because you don't have Pavel Zacha's services. But the familiarity that David Pastrnak would have with Pavel Zacha, I just think, has been sorely missed for the Czechs in this tournament so far. So again, we'll see if Pastrnak can find his dominant mojo in this tournament going forward. Team Canada with a 10-2 win over France in their final game of group play. And the story coming out of this one was Tom Wilson getting in a fight. It wasn't really much of a fight. He actually kind of didn't take his gloves off really or throw any punches because he realized that, as I said earlier in the argument between about surrounding four nations face-off versus the Olympics, if you get in a fight in Olympic play, you get kicked out of the game and possibly suspended. So Tom Wilson did not want to be suspended for the Canadians quarterfinal game. So he didn't really go too crazy, but that was kind of the storyline coming out of that game. In addition to just the total domination by Team Canada, Macklin Celebrini doing his thing as a 19-year-old is nothing short of impressive. Connor McDavid is just performing like the best player in the world that he is. And we'll touch on Team Canada a little bit later on. Denmark got a 4-2 win over Latvia, so that puts them in third place in the Group C. And then the U.S. had a 5-2 win over Team Germany to finish out action in group play for the Americans. So I would say for Team USA, they did what they had to do in group play. They had 3 regulation wins. They finished with 9 points. But the idea that finishing second overall in group play behind the Canadians, that their reward for finishing second could very well be a quarterfinal matchup against Sweden. Oh boy, that is not what you wanted for a U.S. team. You expect to play maybe Sweden or Finland in the semifinals, right? But the quarterfinals in short tournaments like this, you like to be able to hold off on playing those top teams as best as you can to give yourself more and more time to build your game. Right now, and we'll get to what the qualification matchups are in a little bit, but the Swedes are playing Latvia, I believe. So that's a game that that Sweden should win. And for the U.S. to play Latvia and then Denmark and then Germany, where you've only played a total of maybe 10 NHL players, to have to then play Sweden in the quarters. Oof, that's you have to start that game on time and you can't let up. Like Sweden will make you pay. If you play Sweden in the quarters and they get an early jump on you because they've played more recently and they get an early goal on you on Team USA. Team USA is going to get real tight real quick. And so on the other hand, if you play Sweden in the quarters, if you're Team USA and you beat them, well, now you advance to the semifinals and you've done so beating one of the best teams in the tournament, and you should be better battle tested, but it's going to be a tough hurdle to get over in the quarters if they do play the Swedes. So let's get into what the standings are after group play. And in Group A, Canada wins Group A going away. Perfect record, 9 points. They're followed by the Swiss, the Czechs, and then Team France. France with 0 points, unfortunately. Again, pretty much went as expected. I actually thought that the Czechs would finish second in this group and potentially fifth overall in the standings, but the Swiss had a great tournament, and they have some good players too. I mean, Roman Josi, Timo Meier, Kevin Fiala, as I mentioned, even though he got hurt. So there are some others, but the Swiss, they played well. They played as a program that you can tell internationally that a lot of these guys play together. Group B, as I mentioned, was an absolute slugfest. Slovakia, Finland, and Sweden all end up with the same record and the same amount of points. As I mentioned earlier, Slovakia gets the group win based on goal differential. And then the Italians, again, with 0 points. Group C did go to the Americans, as I mentioned, also similar to Canada, perfect record of 9 points. And then Germany, Denmark, and Latvia all finished with the same record and the same amount of points with 3. So heading into these games, we all kind of knew that Group C was going to be the weakest in terms of depth. And that's kind of how it played out. We knew it was top heavy with the Americans, and Russia would have been in this group had they been allowed to play in the Olympic Games. So if Russia was in this tournament, the U.S. wouldn't have had the cakewalk that they did, but Russia's not. And so you kind of knew that the US were going to rather easily win this group. And if they didn't, then it would have been shame on them. Group B going to the Slovakians, as I said earlier, that was a surprise. I mean, they were predicted to finish third in this group by me. I thought it was going to be either Sweden or Finland as one, the other as two, and then the Slovaks as three. But Slovakia getting that early win over the Finns was an upset. And, Juraj Slafkovsky has played fantastic for them, been one of the best players in the tournament. So they have a bye to the quarterfinals. And then your 4 teams with a bye are the Canadians, the Slovaks, the Americans, and the Finns. So for the most part, it's the teams we thought were going to have a bye. I thought before the tournament started, it would be the Canadians, the Americans, the Finns, and the Swedes. Obviously, sub out the Swedes for the Slovakians. So that is where the groups ended up. And as far as a playoff preview, or I guess we'll call it the knockout round preview, we do now know what the qualification games are going to be and who those teams will play in the quarterfinals should they advance. So those games are Germany versus France. The winner of that game will play Slovakia in the quarterfinals. Next, we have Italy versus Switzerland, and they will play the Finns in the quarterfinals, whoever wins that game. Czech Republic plays Denmark. The winner of that game will play the Canadians. And then Sweden and Latvia will play for the right to take on USA in the quarterfinals. So again, as I mentioned, the US finished second overall in the standings, and their reward is likely going to be playing the Swedes in the quarterfinals, barring an upset. And that would be a pretty major upset. I mean, again, Latvia is scrappy, but if they were to beat the Swedes, that would be a major upset. And it would be a team that the US has already played and already beaten. So that's a game that the US, if you're sitting in the Olympic Village preparing for the quarterfinals, I think it's probably safe to start preparing for Team Sweden if you're the US coaching staff and the players. But crazy things can happen. And in a short tournament like this, all it takes is for one goalie to get really hot. And it doesn't take, hockey's an interesting sport because oftentimes, over the course of a 7-game series, the better team should win. But in a 1-game scenario, if you have a roster on paper that's vastly superior than their opponent, and they're not getting the results that they wanted, and the puck's not going in, frustration starts to creep in, and it's very easy to get off your game. And so we'll see what happens if the Swedes go down early to Latvia. For a team that has already had a difficult tournament in Sweden, they have not met their expectations to their standards. If I'm Team Latvia, you want to hit them hard and early and see if Team Sweden can battle the fight between the ears. So we'll see what happens. But as far as the other matchups go, you have Germany versus France, which, again, you have Leon Draisaitl, Tim Stützle, you have Mo Seider. I mean, that should be a relatively easy win. Well, I shouldn't say that, but JJ Peterka, another one, Nico Sturm, like the Germans should beat the French. There's just no other way to say it. France is, they have one NHL player and a couple of formers. And so this really should be a situation where the Germans are playing the Slovakians in the quarterfinals. As far as Italy versus the Swiss, I would say the exact same thing. I mean, when you're Team Switzerland, even though you don't have Kevin Fiala, if you have Roman Josi and Timo Meyer, Nico Hischier, like you need to beat Team Italy. And that'll be an interesting quarterfinal matchup between the Swiss and the Finns, but we'll get to that in a second. Again, I don't want to discount anybody, but if we're going off of probability, it should be the Swiss versus the Finns. And then the Czech Republic versus Denmark, to me, that's probably a pick 'em. I mean, having seen Denmark play the US, they played them pretty solid. And, I think the Czechs have, obviously more high end talent with Thomas Hurdle, David Pasternak, Marty Necas. As I said, Pavel Zacha is not in the tournament for the Czechs. He's hurt, but they still have Andre Palat. Andre Kasha is a former NHL player, Radko Gudas. On the back end, Philip Ronak. The Czechs have a deeper roster than Denmark, but Denmark has, Nikolai Ehlers leading the way. They have Lars Eller, who has been a really respected NHL player for, I want to say, 15 years or longer now. And they play hard. Again, a lot of these European teams, they don't have a ton of NHL talent, and so they're constantly playing together as a unit in world championships. And I'm pretty sure a lot of these guys even take time away throughout the year from their professional clubs to have some national practices. So there is familiarity and chemistry with these teams that have less NHL talent on them, just because of how the dynamics work. So it seems to me like the quarterfinal matchups should be, without barring any upsets, it should be Germany versus Slovakia, Switzerland versus Finland. I'm gonna say the Czech Republic versus Canada in what would be a group play rematch, and then Sweden versus the US. And then from there, we're talking probably Slovakia versus Germany. To me, is a pick 'em. I think the edge has to go to Slovakia just based on how they've played in this tournament so far. But I think that would be a very close game. But I do think Slovakia would make the semifinals from there. If I had to guess, I would say Slovakia. And that's the respect you earn if you win your group. And then Finland versus the Swiss, it should be the Finns. Canada should be whoever they play, whether it's the Czechs or the Danes. And then the US versus Sweden, I'm not going to say it's a pick 'em, but it's probably a hell of a lot closer of a matchup than the Americans would have hoped for in the quarterfinals. And while I would pick the Americans to win that game, playing what I think is the third or fourth best team in the quarterfinals is certainly anything's capable of happening in that game. So I would say the US should win, but if Sweden somehow won that game, it wouldn't shock me in the least, just because the Swedes have always had an elite program. So you probably are looking at the four teams that are currently sitting with buys to the quarterfinals. I would still have them moving on. That said, how often does that actually happen that smoothly? I don't know. I guess we'll find out. So in any event, that is how the playoff round is shaking up right now. But here's the question I wanted to get to off the top, and that is, does it really matter? Like who's beating Canada? And I don't mean to say does it really matter as in, hey, pack your bags, everybody, don't even try to win an Olympic gold medal. Because as I've said multiple times on this show, the Americans are right there with the Canadians. They are right there. I think the Americans have better goaltending, and I think the Americans have a better overall blue line. I think the Americans may have an overall better roster than Team Canada. But having watched the Canadians so far in group play, it just kind of feels to me like it doesn't really matter if the Americans have the better decor or the better goaltending, because that's how damn good Connor McDavid is. I mean, there's everybody else, and then there's Connor McDavid. He does whatever he wants, and if it were a situation where it was the NHL and you had to shut him down for one game, then okay, like I would let can you beat the Oilers in one game? Yeah, absolutely. Even though they have Leon Draisaitl, you can shut down Connor McDavid and Draisaitl in one game. But the problem with Team Canada is it's not just McDavid. It's Macklin Celebrini. It's Sidney Crosby. It's Nathan McKinnon. right? Like their forward core has so much speed and skill that it doesn't matter how good of a defensive team you are. If Connor McDavid and Macklin Celebrini and Nathan McKinnon are put together again, because they've had moments where they've been together in this tournament, they're unstoppable. They're just unstoppable. They're unstoppable in transition. They hunt pucks better than anybody in the offensive zone. They pressure defense. It's man, I don't know. I'm obviously pulling for the Americans. I am American. I acknowledge how good the Americans are. And this isn't just to say that it could only be the Americans versus the Canadians. As I said, if the Canadians play the Finns in the semifinals, which is kind of how it's looking, it would shape up to be. It's looking like right now the biggest hurdle for the US to get to the gold medal game very well may be in the quarterfinals. Whereas for the Canadians, it'll be in the semifinals. So if the Americans can beat the Swedes, presumably in the quarterfinals, they should make relatively easy work of the Slovakians in a semifinal matchup. The Canadians presumably should beat the Czechs or the Danes in the quarterfinals relatively easily, and then they'll be tested in the semis against the Finns, assuming that the Finns take care of business against who was it that they would be playing? The Finns would be playing the Swiss, right? So yeah, so Finland and Sweden are more than capable of making it to the gold medal game and upsetting somebody, but I just don't see anybody beating Canada. I hope I'm wrong, right? Like I said, as an American, I hope the Americans can find a way to win a gold medal. And it wouldn't surprise me entirely if they did. As I said, they're so damn good as well. But man, in these moments, these one-off moments, all it takes is one play for McDavid. It just takes one shift, one turnover, one defenseman on an off pivot, and McDavid just completely exposes and takes advantage. And I don't know. As I've said before, it's the Canadians are the gold standard until proven otherwise. And right now, man, and I know their last game was against the French, but to see how fast McDavid was skating up the ice in transition, it's I've never seen anything like it. And as good as Jack Eichel is, as good as Austin Matthews is, and the Tkachuk brothers, and Jack Hughes and Tage Thompson and Dylan Larkin and Matt Boldy, like the Americans have a ton of good forwards. I mean, they're unbelievable. They're all some of the best in the league. They're all captains on their own teams, right? And their blue line: Quinn Hughes, Charlie McAvoy, Jacob Slavin, Brock Faber, Jake Sanderson, Hannafin, or Zach Werenski, for Christ's sake, is on your third D pair, although he's been kind of taking shifts with Hughes as well. The Americans are outstanding. I don't look at anybody on Team USA, especially up front, and say, when they want to score, they're going to go score, no matter who's on the ice against them. I can say that about Connor McDavid. If Connor McDavid wants to go out there at any moment and just take over, he's gonna. So it's gonna take a world-class performance from Team USA up and down their lineup to stop not only Connor McDavid, not only Macklin Celebrini, not only Nathan McKinnon, not only Sidney Crosby, but the rest of Canadians roster as well. I mean, Cale Makar, I haven't even mentioned Cale Makar's name once yet. I mean, he's the best defenseman in the world. Team USA has the best decor all around, in my opinion, on paper. But on paper doesn't really mean that much in these games either. Like, would I rather have Quinn Hughes, Charlie McAvoy, Zach Werenski, Brock Faber, Jacob Slavin, Jake Sanderson, Noah Hannafin? Would I rather have those guys over the group of Makar, Theodore, Parayko, Morrissey, Doughty, Harley, Sanheim? Like, yeah. But you know what? Colton Parayko, he's a tough son of a bitch to play against. He does not give you much ice, right? Like, it's I don't know. It doesn't really matter on paper, but it does matter in terms of Connor McDavid because he is just stupid. Him and Celebrini and McKinnon, when they're on a line together, it's just not fair. So we'll see. Does that put more pressure on the Canadians? Absolutely. I just think that, their roster, their forward core is so good. And really their top 3 or 4 players, it's speed like you've never seen. And, Team USA has their work cut out for them against the Swedes. If Sweden does indeed advance to the quarterfinals, then they're going to have to get by somebody in the semis as well to even get to play Team Canada. And Canada has to take care of business as well on their end. But if those two teams are on a collision course for the gold medal game, A, I can't wait for it. B, I would expect Canada to somehow find a way. But I wouldn't rule out the Americans. And if they do somehow win the gold medal, I do think it would be a pretty a relatively decent upset, because I just think that Canada has 3 of the best players in the world in Makar, McKinnon, and McDavid. And there's probably arguments to be made that right now, Macklin Celebrini is one of the top 5 players in the world. That's how good he is too. So let alone Sidney Crosby, who's one of the best of all time. So anyway, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you all very much for listening. I didn't say it off the top, so I'll say it now. If you haven't done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the PuckUps on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts. And if you want to get in touch with me or be a part of the show in the future, you can email me, info@thepuckups.com. You can tweet at me on X at @BrianDFelice_. You can tweet at the show at the PuckUps. You can call and leave a voicemail to be aired on the program by calling 617-539-6958. And as always, you can comment on YouTube, TikTok, any socials, Instagram, and I collect all the questions and whatnot, and we'll do a mailbag pretty soon. Obviously, the Bruins are still off, so during this Olympic break, we'll get back into Bruins talk as well. I just think that the Olympics right now, they're first and foremost, and they don't come around very often. And so, look forward to all of these games taking place. The qualification games are on Tuesday. Semifinals are on Wednesday. And the quarterfinals are on Wednesday. Semifinals are on Friday. So we may very well do an episode on Thursday to recap the quarterfinals and preview the semifinals, and then we will recap the gold medal game on Monday. That, of course, is at 8 in the morning on Sunday, because who doesn't want to watch a gold medal game at 8 a.m. on a Sunday?